Hello and welcome to another edition of TaxCalc TV, in which we are going to be covering the ABCs of AML. So I'm Andy North, and once again I'm joined by the awesome Dean Shepherd, the Director of Product Compliance here at TaxCalc, and by the equally awesome Siobhan Wilkes, who is the Product Director with responsibility for our anti-money laundering product. So you've got lots of expertise to be drawing on. So why are we doing this? Earlier in the year, you may have joined us when we had Anne White, who's a TaxCalc customer, and she told us all about how she had been through a practice assurance inspection, and that was very much based around anti-money laundering. And she explained the various processes and preparation that she had done and managed to pass that inspection with flying colours. But we had a lot of response from that from firms who were slightly concerned that they would never pass that kind of inspection. And indeed, I was chatting to an accountant at the Accountex show earlier in the year, and she assured me that she thought that she was completely up straight with her anti-money laundering by virtue of the fact that she conducted the ID checks when she onboarded a client. Now, obviously, there is a great deal more to it than that. So we wanted to effectively summarise those key points of activity that you're going to need to be able to check off and sign off to give you the assurance that you can sleep comfortably knowing that you're going to pass the inspection. First of all, we're going to look at the recent guidance from the CCAB and also very much how you are able to evidence that, because doing the checks is one thing, but being able to evidence the fact that you've done them is equally important if you're going to be able to get through an inspection. So before we start, yes, we will be sending a copy of this to you at the end of the session, so you don't necessarily need to take notes if you don't want to. There's always a lot of questions, particularly around the subject of anti-money laundering. Please post any questions you have throughout the session using the Q&A box within the on the screen. We will see those, the rest of the attendees will not. If you want to use the chat function, that will be seen by each of you, but not by us. So before we start, we'd like to just gauge what your impression is of how well you are doing. So Dean, if you'd like to launch the poll.
Okay, I'm going to make this poll live, and apologies to anybody who's had any issues with video or sound. We had a few teething problems right at the start of this presentation. It's all being captured here in the studio, so you will be able to watch this back, anything that you missed right at the very beginning. But hopefully everybody can hear us and see us now. So I've made the first poll live. Hopefully that's come up on your screens. If it hasn't, you can go and click on the little polls option in the bottom right of your browser next to the Q&A and the chat. And we just want to get an idea of how confident you are that your firm is currently complying with all the AML regulations. So the options that we've got there are that you are not confident at all, and that probably explains why some of you are here today. That you're reasonably confident and you're just here looking for a bit of a refresher, or that you're super confident and you want to bring on that inspector and show them what's what. So we should just let that run a moment. Okay, so lots of people feeling reasonably confident. We're into the 70% plus that are pretty confident here and just looking for a bit of a refresher. The majority of the rest aren't confident at all, and that's why they're here. And we've got 5 and counting people that are super confident and really want us to bring on that practice assurance visit and show the inspector what's what.
Fantastic. So let's see how you get on as we go through here. So Dean, you wanted to just run through those latest CCAB guidance. So yeah, what's happened?
Okay, so one of the motivations for doing this session today was the fact that the CCAB published revised guidance maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago now. Just for a little bit of history on the CCAB. guidance, but I think because the money laundering regulations are so wide-ranging and apply to lots of different sectors, it was felt that it was hard for accountants and tax advisors to disseminate what's particularly relevant and applying it to the tax and accountancy practices that they're in. So the CCAB got together, the Consultative Committee of Accountancy Bodies, and produced some guidance that's specific for the accounting sector. Now, every AML supervisory body in the accountancy sector, so that's not just the CCAB bodies, it's also the bookkeeping bodies that have signed up, AAT, ATT, even HMRC. So if you aren't a member of one of those supervisory bodies and you're being supervised by HMRC, they've also signed up to this CCAB guidance, and it has now been approved by HM Treasury as well. So they've endorsed that guidance as being reflective of the anti-money laundering regulations as applicable to tax and accounting practices.
Okay. So what have we got? Do you want to run through the key points?
Yeah, so for those of you that weren't aware, if you looked at this CCAB guidance, and we've quite often referenced it in the material that we've done on AML, for the past couple of years it's been kind of sat in draft awaiting HM Treasury approval. Well, that approval's now being given, but there has been some changes that happened between that original document published in 2000 and the one that is live now. So we're going to pop up a nice little graphic for you here that will just take you through some of the key changes that are in the differences between those two documents. So if you were already familiar with the guidance and you just want to know what's changed between now and the previously released one, then we've got these up on screen here. If you just enter CCAB AML guidance into your search engine of choice, then you will also be able to get a copy of the guidance and also some explanatory notes as to these changes. Siobhan, I know we've looked at this. Are there any there that kind of catch your eye as being particularly interesting or relevant to our customers?
Yeah, so the one that I thought was most interesting is the change in the requirement there from being recommended to compulsory, really, is the viewing of the identification documents. So it's saying that you must see those now rather than just accepting having not seen them. So you need to see an original copy of those. So that obviously is something that applies to every client due diligence, really. So whereas some of the other bits aren't necessarily applicable to every single client due diligence sort of activity, that one is. So that was the one that was really interesting, I thought.
Great. And for me, I think the considering the supervisory authority guidance, I should probably point out, if it wasn't clear from this graphic, that all these items that you see on screen were in the original guidance, but they actually changed how much emphasis there was on it. So all these items on the list were described as each practice should consider them. That's been changed, the wording, so it's now that each practice must consider them. And it's made clear that when the word should is used, that's indication of good practice. So you should be doing these things. Where must is used, that's a regulatory requirement. So in the guidance, this is basically saying that all these areas are not just good practice, they're regulatory requirement. And I think we'll go into a bit more of the detail of what some of these things are as we go through the session today. But that one that caught my eye about supervisory authority guidance being a requisite is quite interesting, because actually this CCAB AML guidance document, it's 137 pages long, so it's no short piece of work to digest, but your responsibilities don't stop there. Whichever supervisory body you're a member of, they will also be producing their own guidance that may create additional responsibilities on you as a member of that professional body. And the guidance is quite clear that where there is additional responsibilities placed upon you, then you have to adhere to those as well. So although we always consider this CCAB AML guidance as kind of the primary resource for information that you need in relation to AML, and it is a really good source if you want to, a source of reference if you want to go and look something up. You do also need to consider what information that your supervisory body put out there for you. And I think we can all agree that different supervisory bodies are better than others when it comes to putting information out to support their members. We got one note down the bottom on there about another change that was kind of outside of this recommended to compulsory, and that was the time frame for reporting persons with significant control discrepancies that you identify. That's down to 15 days, is that right, Siobhan?
Yeah, that's right, Dean. I think some people were saying they couldn't hear me before. Hopefully that's been resolved now. But yeah, so 15 days it's changed to from the 30 days it was originally.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, because Companies House have been in contact with us recently to suggest that they're not happy with the accuracy of the information that they hold when it comes to people with significant control. That's both in terms of people keeping that up to date on the public record, but also when companies are being formed, they're finding that either people aren't being listed as PSCs when they should be, or they're being listed when they don't have significant control. So it's certainly an area that they're looking at in particular and want that information to get up to date. And I think most of the professional bodies say as soon as is reasonably practical, and I think the guidance coming down to 15 days is saying that that is more than enough time to clarify any information with a client and get that information updated with Companies House.
So before, we're not going to move on to an examination of particularly the AML Centre and how firms use that. So before we do that, we'd like just to ask another quick poll, if at all possible, which is around what software that people are currently using. Do you actually use software internally, or how else are you keeping notes? Dean, is that ready to go?
Yes, I can make that poll live. Okay, so we're basically asking the question here, do you currently use any dedicated software to support you with AML compliance? So the answers are no. Simply, you don't use any software to do that. You do that using your regular software for documenting records. Or you can answer yes, but you only use it for electronic verification checks. So electronic verification services are very popular, and there's lots of those available from ourselves and other places. So if you do use software for that, then please tick yes. Or if you use a full AML compliance product that has electronic verification checks and everything else that you would need to kind of meet the requirements of the regulations. So for recording and documenting your firm-wide risk assessment, full client due diligence, and all the other topics that we're going to come on to in this session today. Okay.
Give it a few moments for those to come in.
Okay, let's have a look. So, yep, around 40% or so of respondents aren't currently using any AML specialist software of any kind. Around a third are using software, but only for the electronic verification checks. And we have about a quarter of people hovering around the 24-25% mark that do use a full AML software solution to document and record everything.
Right, so there's a lot of people out there who are probably flying a little bit blind and having to do quite a lot of work, especially given what we went through with Anne. So Siobhan, if you can take us through those key bits, we want to look at kind of the identification, the verification, the due diligence, the risk assessments and the reporting.
Yeah, I think what we were going to do first is that Dean was going to go through the firm-wide.
Yeah, I'll go through the firm-wide.
Dean, my error, I do apologise.
A little bit ahead of yourself.
So we want to do the firm-wide risk assessment first.
A little bit ahead of yourself, yeah. So what we'll do, I think rather than have me create a whole set of PowerPoint slides and give you death by PowerPoint, our AML Centre software was based on the CCAB guidance and actually takes you quite logically through the guidance and everything that you need to record and evidence. So what I will do is I will share my screen and then we can take a look at the areas within the product but that'll actually cover off all the key areas within the guidance that we want to talk about today. So for those of you familiar with TaxCalc, you recognise this screen. This is the launcher for opening up all the TaxCalc range of products, and we've got AML Centre here. So if you are currently a user of AML Centre, you'll see that there. Now, when you open up AML Centre, we've got two options here: the firm-wide compliance. That's what I'm going to go through right now, and then Siobhan's going to cover off the client due diligence and your responsibilities there. So if we open the software, now AML is something that, unless you are the firm's MLRO, it's something that you're probably not going to be using day in, day out like you do with your tax products or your accounts products. So we do have some explanatory videos within the product to kind of help you understand what you need to do and where. Like all our products on the left-hand side, we've got the kind of simple step menus that take you through chronologically what you need to be doing when you use the product. And that's no different for AML. So in the status management side here, we've got a list of all the clients, and it's in here that you can track your identification and where you're getting in terms of risk assessment and verification. Siobhan's going to take you through those areas. Suspicious activity reports are always a very topical area, and if you do have questions, do just fire them into the Q&A, and we'll try and address as many of those as we go through. But it's within here that you've got oversight of any suspicious activity reports, and that's both internal and external. So it's only your money laundering reporting officer that will be able to see this screen and all the suspicious activity reports, and it will be them with whom the responsibility lies for determining whether an internally generated suspicious activity report requires submission to the NCA, and those can all be logged here. So if any members of your team create such a report, then the MLRO will get a notification that a report's been created, so they can go in, review, and ultimately determine what decision they want to make. Okay, so one of the key areas I want to look at is the internal controls, because there are quite significant obligations placed upon your practice, even if you're a practice of one, in terms of internal controls. So I've already mentioned money laundering reporting officer. So if you are a sole trader, a sole practitioner, then you are by default your firm's money laundering reporting officer. If there's more than one of you in the firm, then you can appoint somebody to be an MLRO. And if that somebody isn't senior in the firm, so isn't a partner or a director or senior leadership team member, then you'll also have to appoint a money laundering compliance principal, which is somebody who may not be the MLRO but has enough seniority within the practice to be influencing policy on money laundering.
Okay.
You were looking like you were going to pose a question for me, Andy.
I was just going to ask Amanda as written in. So she's a self-employed bookkeeper.
Yeah.
And she says that she knows many bookkeepers who have never registered. What's the standing with the bookkeeping sector?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one, because often in the regulations, it's there isn't quite there isn't a good definition between, you know, what's an accountant, what's a tax advisor, what's a bookkeeper, but the regulations do, or the guidance does state that accountancy services do fall within the definition of regulated activity. So if you are doing bookkeeping activities, whether that is going as far as doing the final accounts and tax return or not, you are still providing a regulated service as far as AML is concerned. So all bookkeepers would also be caught within the regulations as well. And if you're a member of one of the bookkeeping professional bodies, then they will be your supervisory body if you choose them to be so. Otherwise, you'll need to register with HMRC. Right.
So those friends of yours, Amanda, you need to probably alert them that they do need to register indeed. So.
Great. Yeah, so just in this section, you can just record who your money laundering reporting officer and money laundering compliance principals are. And I think the context of everything that we do in the software is basically giving you the ability to evidence that you've done everything correctly, so that if you are subject to a practice assurance visit, and we know that on a practice assurance visit, AML compliance is a real high priority at the moment. All the supervisory bodies are under pressure to increase their levels of compliance. And this is all about evidencing that you've done the right things. Because we believe that generally most people in practice are doing the right things. They're just not necessarily going to be able to prove it in the event of an inspection, and this will certainly help you do so. So the next item we've got here is just somewhere to record the personal development and training for those key compliance officers, because the regulations do state that if you are being appointed or are appointed as an MLRO or MLCP, then you need to have the right level of knowledge, skills and training to be able to fulfil that role that is specified in the regulations as a requirement. So you're going to need to evidence the training that you've had. So any specific AML training for those key compliance officers can be recorded in here, and it's just useful to have a record of that if ever required to prove it. I've talked quite a lot about the supervisory bodies, and that can vary from practice to practice. Within software you can record who your supervisory body is. As I said, all the UK supervisory bodies relevant to the accounting sector have signed up to this CCAB guidance, so they're kind of all working to the same rules, but they will have their own additional rules on top of that. I know that I have heard that one of the bookkeeping bodies, I can never remember which one it is, but does place certain requirements on using software that they provide in order to do certain things. And if you don't use the software that they provide, then you're in breach of their guidance. And we do know of some people that have got into spot or bother with their professional body because they didn't follow that supervisory body's prescribed guidance on what they should be doing.
And could you use other software in tandem with that, or?
Yes, you could certainly use it in tandem. I can't remember what element. Maybe somebody can pop in the chat what element that was. I don't know whether it was. I don't know whether it was the verification checks or whether it was the kind of firm-wide compliance area that we're looking at now that was prescribed. But yeah, it is important to check with your own professional body what their expectations are.
I think Minnie said there that it was the ICB.
Okay.
The
ICB. So ICB members, be very careful that you don't breach their rules. Beneficial owners, officers, and managers. Booms. I just love that expression. Booms. So who's a boom? So your beneficial owners. That's anybody with 25% or more beneficial ownership of the practice. Officers, it's quite straightforward. So that's any partners in a partnership, any members of an LLP, any directors of a limited company if you're trading as a limited company. Managers, this isn't your stationary cupboard manager. This is your senior managers, senior leadership team members responsible for policy within your practice. So there are additional responsibilities and obligations that are put on booms. So you need to keep a record of the booms within your practice and the point at which they become, particularly if people becoming members of a partnership, that will mean they've gone from being an employee perhaps to being a boom, and then they have to adhere to the additional regulations that creates, or additional obligations that creates. And I think for most of the professional bodies, it's that you will need to do a criminal records check on those individuals. You need to ascertain that they're of the right integrity to hold that position of responsibility within a practice. We do often get asked, who do we have to do a DBS check, the Disclosure and Barring Service, that is the criminal records check in England and Wales, and the regulations tend to defer the answer to that question to the supervisory bodies. It's up to them. The regulations just really talk about confirming that these people have the right integrity and skills and experience and that type of thing without falling short of being prescriptive of you must do a DBS check. But I think quite a few of the professional bodies now say that one must be done. Within our software, you can go to the link. So if you're not in England and Wales, if you're in Scotland, you can go to the equivalent services in Scotland or the equivalent services in Northern Ireland, but that'll take you off to those respective websites. You can get the DBS check done to confirm that there's no unspent criminal convictions for your prospective booms. It's also within the regulations that those appointments should be approved by your supervisory bodies. I know some of the supervisory bodies have a procedure whereby you will register your booms with the supervisory body. So if that's the case for yours, then please do check to make sure that you've done that. And when you've received confirmation either from your supervisory body or from doing a DBS check, that can also be recorded in the software here, and you can click through onto the DBS certificate if you're wanting to record it there. That's all possible. If I just go into edit, we can also record different information about those booms, so who they're supervised by, what checks were done, whether it was a DBS check, and dates for approval and that kind of thing. But yes, very, very important to check with your supervisory body the requirements for booms. Staff training records, I won't go into that area, but it's similar to the continuing personal development for your key compliance officers. There is a requirement that any staff involved in areas where potential money laundering offences can be detected should be appropriately trained in knowing what to look out for, how to make suspicious activity reports and to whom. So again, if you want to record your specific AML training for everybody in your firm, then that can be done within the software. Policies and procedures, this is always a very important area of internal controls. So the regulations, you can go into the regulations and see exactly what's required in terms of policies and procedures. We often get asked, do we include standard AML policies within our software that people can just pick up and run with? We don't. And the reason for that is that the requirements of each professional body is slightly different. There's about a dozen UK supervisory bodies, and we can't be creating a slightly different one for each body and then monitoring every time they make changes. So if your supervisory body does provide samples or templates, then do use those from them. Otherwise, there are a number of different options, I'm sure, for finding policies that you can select and upload into the software here to keep track of them. What I would say is that I'd probably avoid taking a policy off the shelf, just dumping it in your software or saving it somewhere on your network and saying, that's it, I've ticked a box, I've got my policies and procedures in place for the practice, because you really should tailor those policies to your own practice in your own circumstances. Everybody's practice is a little bit different, and also everybody's practices will evolve. So you might be a sole practitioner today and one particular policy suits the fact that you're a sole practitioner, but as you take on staff and become a little bit bigger, then those policies might not necessarily apply in quite the same way that they do. We can talk about what kind of amendments you might make to your policies when we kind of dive into the risk assessment areas, because that will give you some kind of indication of the differences that you might need to consider. Just within the software here, we've got an area here to confirm when the policies were last reviewed. Again, we often get asked, how often should you be reviewing policies? Is it an annual thing? You'll find if you read the regulations, unless your professional body tells you otherwise, that they kind of shy away from saying, yes, you must do this annually or every 6 months or every 2 years. They always put the onus back on you to assess the risk. But they do say that most things like this are event driven. So if nothing has changed, then there's no kind of reason for you to relook at what you've got. But if your circumstances have changed, if you're providing new services, if your team has grown, if the nature in which you're delivering services have changed, if there are any kind of fundamental changes in the way you're going about your business, then that is a flag for, well, we need to assess the impact on our AML policies and procedures at that point, and probably more importantly, record that you've done it, because a fundamental change like that might not mean you need to change your policies and procedures, but if you are subject to an inspection, then you will need to show adequate evidence that you assessed it and reviewed it at the time.
Is there a definition really of what that change might, what the magnitude of that change that we should require a review?
So within the regulations, there are examples of the areas that could impact whether your policies and procedures are still appropriate. And in fact, they follow quite closely to the different risk factor areas that we'll come onto in the risk assessment area. So if I pop those up. So what I've got here, this is where you're actually recording the firm-wide risk assessment. So this isn't looking on a client-client basis, but looking at your practice as a whole, what areas of risk from an AML perspective there might be. So here I can just see that I've done one previously here on the 24th of May. I'm just going to duplicate that one. That's an option we have within the software, because that will save you. Once you've done it once, there probably aren't going to be huge changes that you need to make in your firm-wide risk assessment. So if it is something that you're doing perhaps annually or every couple of years, or if there has been a change, you don't need to go through the whole process again. You can take what you've done last time and just check to see if it still applies or not. So if we can just see down the left-hand side there, we've got the different risk assessment areas, so clients, geography, products and services, transactions, and delivery channels. These are all the areas taken straight out of the guidance. And just on this first page here, again, because as I mentioned earlier with the kind of explanatory videos, because this is probably something you're not going to be doing day in, day out, we do have this kind of step-by-step explanation of how the risk assessment works, how we calculate whether something is high risk, normal risk, low risk, just so that whoever's doing this isn't kind of left in the dark or left to kind of figure out, try and remember what they did last time. So we give quite a lot of explanation alongside. But if I just kind of dive into the different areas, we go into a client area. So these are all the kind of areas of client risk that you might face. So whether your clients, and remember we're not looking at a single client, this is firm-wide, so are your clients likely to be a new business relationship? Are you a fast expanding firm? Is it likely that your clients are not known to you and your staff? That could be indicative if you're a very new firm, so you're taking on very new clients, you don't have that long history. Your clients politically exposed persons, that creates additional areas of risk and mitigation. And if I just go into one of these areas, within each area of risk, you can give it a score on the likelihood of that being the case. So for a politically exposed person, here I've got a likelihood score of 1 because it's quite rare. We don't come across politically exposed persons very often, but if we do, what's the impact? What's the increased risk of there being an AML issue with such a client? Well, I've said it's major there. It could be, you could rate it anywhere from no risk at all the way through to catastrophic. And again, much of the onus is put on you within your firm to assess the risk that you think exists. Now this gives a normal to low risk because it's quite a rare circumstance. If you weren't happy, if you felt you needed to mitigate that risk, then you can go in and put in a new risk. So if I wasn't happy that normal to low was acceptable for my practice and I wanted that to be a low risk, I can change that that resultant risk to low and give the reason for it. So basically, as a firm, I've decided that I'm not going to act for any politically exposed persons because I don't want the risk that that's going to open my practice up to. So that's a strategic decision, and that's absolutely fine. That brings the risk down to low. And where I mentioned before that working through this can influence your policies and procedures, well, what I would want to be doing, having decided that, is then go off to my policies and procedures and make it crystal clear in there that we do not act for politically exposed persons. So any potential clients we identify as politically exposed, it is our policy that we don't act for them, so it doesn't become an issue for the firm. If I go in and make any changes to any of the policies, then actually everybody else in the organisation gets a notification to say that policy has been updated. I think personally I would also send an email around at least to everybody to say, look, we've changed the policy, here's what it is. But everybody will get a notification of a change, so things like that don't get missed. So within all these different areas, we've kind of identified all the different types of clients that can present risk based on all these different areas that we've got on there, and you can go in and assess the risk, and if you choose to, mitigate that risk across your practice by making policy or procedural decisions for the practice. Probably, I could demonstrate other areas that the software can kind of help, but I think we probably want to stick to what's useful in terms of what the guidance says. But essentially, working through this from top to bottom in our simple step process, you'll get to an overall risk assessment of the practice. You can determine whether you think that's acceptable or not for your practice, and if it's not, what you're going to do to reduce that overall risk, and more importantly, just document it. So from within here, we can run off reports. All our reports you can export into Word, print to PDF, and this documents everything. I'd say that most of our customers just leave the report within the software here, but if you do want to send it elsewhere within your document management system or wherever else you store company documents, then that's absolutely fine. Okay, I think that's probably it from a firm-wide risk assessment process.
There was a few questions that I'd like to bring up. So we've had these two questions particularly, or one around the money laundering officer, and how often is there a mandate on how often they need to undertake training and demonstrate that? Is that an annual thing?
No, I don't think it's really defined in the guidance how often that must be happening. I think they have to keep on top of any guidance that's available, so they need to be sort of taking an active interest in what's going on and understanding those processes and what applies to them. So I don't think I've seen anywhere that dictates a specific period of time, but yeah, they need to be obviously updated and making sure they're keeping ahead of the legislation that's being released.
Yeah, I think there's been a trend in continuing professional development generally, that the onus is becoming more on the individual to assess their own learning needs and make sure that they're up to date on everything that is required of them for their role. That's part of your professional integrity. And I think the same applies here to AML. They're not prescriptive over how often you should be doing courses and things, and what the nature of those courses or the format of those courses should take. It's for the individual, just to make sure that they are confident that they're up to date, and from the firm's perspective, that they're confident that their key compliance officers are up to date with the knowledge they need.
Okay. So there was a question about the pricing, which we'll come on to at the end of the session. Interesting, a couple of points about the firm-wide risk assessment specifically. Question, a cloud-based practice like mine will have very few clients, local clients. They're all over the UK. Does this affect in any way, the firm-wide risk assessment?
It will certainly affect the answers that you give for that firm-wide risk assessment, because you're in the client section, you're going to ask, how well do you know these clients? Are they based local to you? and if you're saying that you've not met a high proportion of clients and a high proportion of clients aren't close to you, then that does create a higher risk. But I think there's a temptation when going through these things, if you see anything other than low risk, there's a temptation that like, this all needs to be low. I can't work with clients if they're high risk. That's not the case. You just have to put appropriate procedures in place so that you're able to manage that risk. And a lot of it is about recognising why there's a risk and what you can do to treat that client a little bit differently. So it might just be, if they're not based local to you, you've not met them in person, then perhaps you want to do more verification checks than you would do for somebody that you've known for a long time who you can physically see runs the shop down the road. And also in terms of the information that they're providing you with, if you're not as easily able to assess whether some transactions are legitimate, for example, then you just need to be aware that you need to be raising more questions of that type of client when you're working with them. Right. So it's not a problem to work with those clients at all. It's just being aware that you might need to do extra steps to satisfy yourself.
I guess the definition of raising them to high risk means that's stage part of mitigating that. Okay, so there were some more questions coming through, but we really do need to get through to the rest of the regulations. And Siobhan, if you could take us through the rest of it.
Thanks, Andy. So Dean's gone through the firm-wide assessment, which we obviously went through our product. We've got the firm-wide risk assessment added into our product, as well as the client due diligence. So when you go into the AML Centre, you get the option as to whether you're wanting to look at the firm-wide compliance, which Dean went into before. It gives you a view of all your policies and procedures and your internal controls, but also gives you a summary of your entire sort of client base and the status of each of the stages of client due diligence that are recommended in the CCAB guidance. So if you were going to do any client due diligence for any of your clients, you can trigger that via the practice list of clients. So you can just go into any individual client, and when you go in there, you'll get asked whether you would like to perform the identification stage. So as part of the guidance, you have to know that you understand your client, you've got the details that are required to identify them accurately. So in our software, when you create that identification stage, it will bring you up a list of all the information that you could possibly need to collect as part of that client due diligence identification stage, and allows you to document and store any of that information in the product here, so that you can evidence that you have found that information out, that you have performed the identification to a satisfactory standard based on the risk that you've applying to the client. So you can enter the basic details here, and if you already know that they are possibly going to have sanctions, or you want to run a check and you know that they are a politically exposed person, you can actually say that in the software here, and you get extra pieces of information to add and record and detail those particular pieces of information, so you can evidence that you have actually researched those things and investigated and found out the information and documented it against the client. So what you can do as well within the software is run the electronic checks. So if you're not meeting your client in person, you may want, as a sort of risk mitigation, to run electronic verification checks for every single client that you onboard. We have a partnership with Equifax, who are a well-known global provider of information. So we can do checks there that identify that they are who they say they are against their name, their address and their bank details if they're entered in here. And it also allows you to do checks for for PEPs and sanctions and relatives or close associates information. So we can check across different watch lists which are allowed from Equifax. So it just checks different lists for you. So if you know that your company is a UK company or a UK client and they only operate in the UK and don't do anything outside the UK, it's probably sufficient enough to do a UK check. But we do offer all the different levels here, and they're all the same cost of one electronic check. So we can perform the check, and as you go through there, it will perform the check and confirm that with Equifax, and you get a report at the end of it. I've gone into one here that I've not entered in the nationality, so I'll just do that so that we can see the check and the report that's displayed at the end of it, because the report is very detailed and allows you to confirm that you've performed that check, and all the details and any PEPs or sanctions or any related information that's found on Equifax's databases will be included in that check. So that can be put on your client's file to prove that that check has occurred, and you can clarify that that's all been logged and saved. So you're able to enter a lot of information in here and record a lot of information, so we can add in any forms of identification that you've seen and verified, and it will store all the details that are required. Basically, the CCAB guidance says that there are lots of different evidence that you can collect and search for your clients. So any of that information you can store and record within the product. And you can clarify that you've had a successful identification as a result of all of those things there. So if there was a reason that you would need to perform some enhanced due diligence for a client, you can do that. We've got information in the product here which tells you what required to produce enhanced due diligence measures. So it's all very useful and informative there, and related back to the guidance for you, so you can look at that there and understand it without having to always go back to the guidance in order to find out. So whenever you enter any of the information here, there was all these reports that you can run off and summarise the details in the same way that you could do for the firm-wide risk assessments. The identification stage and any enhanced due diligence will all be put in the report so that you can see and document and have those ready for any inspector or any proof that you've done all that information or provided all that information. And for any of the stages, whether it's identification or risk assessment, you get a check and finish, which is standard across all our products. So because I selected this one as being a politically exposed person, it's asking me to tell you the country that it's exposed in. So there's a variety of check and finish error messages there to help you along the way and ensure that you're adhering to all of the information being entered in there. So that is the identification stage. So the other stages that we have of client due diligence are obviously the risk assessment. So this is the individual client risk assessment. So in the same way as the firm-wide risk assessment, you're just going through and answering the questions around what might pose a risk, any risk that is set as a default you can mitigate. The templates are dictated by us initially but can be edited or changed for any sort of risk that you or anything that you might find in your particular company is a higher risk than normal for a sort of a standard there. So, and all this information is all summarised in a risk report, which you can put on file, or like Dean said, it's in the software there, you can go back and visit that. And again, we've got the check and finishes that take you through that. So this summary of the AML picture is really useful because it will show any, in this scenario, sanctions that have, if that person has any sanctions against them, any PEPs, the successful or the status of the identification, anything that is referred in terms of an identification or anything that's high risk in terms of a risk assessment will be automatically notified to the MLRO so that they can review and understand whether there needs to be further action or review taking place, and sign that off. So this is a very good summary of everything that's going on. Now, in the same way that Dean said that you can copy the firm-wide risk assessments from one period to another, if you're doing your client due diligence regularly, as in yearly, or whatever policy you might have in terms of how often you would like to be performing the client due diligence, you can actually copy the existing client due diligence and edit and amend it, just reviewing what you have done before in order to edit it. So if I go to create stage, this one already exists, I've created one already, and I can just duplicate that and go in and carry on doing an updated risk assessment. You'll see for this one, I've already got the answers that I did on the previous one, so I can just review and edit those without having to go and re-enter them. So it's useful there as well to be able to see the report, and it should make things quicker, and you can have a summary there again of what the answers were and what your conclusions were. So that's a quick summary of the client due diligence. So the product is based upon the CCAB guidance, really, in that the identification stage allows you to enter any appropriate identification that you're picking up for or researching for the client. You can do the risk assessment, so you're making sure that you've assessed your client from that perspective, the individual client risk assessments, and then you can run the verification, the electronic verification as well. And coming back to, I can't remember who asked the question about the licensing. So
yes, we've had a few questions about around pricing, which might, if you want to address those now.
Yeah, so the electronic checks, so the electronic check with Equifax are priced separately, so that's per check. And AML Centre, the product client limit is based upon clients you wish to perform the client due diligence on. So you can perform client due diligence on individuals and companies. So if you are...
So the question was, what does 50 clients mean? If I act for a limited company, 2 directors, do I have 1 client, 2 clients or 3 clients?
Yes, if you wanted to perform the client due diligence on the actual company, that would be the licence you pay for. So you can see all the associations on a particular company, and you can see all the directors in associations. So unless you wanted to perform individual client due diligence on the directors, you wouldn't need to pay for a licence for them. So it's only the individuals or businesses that you want to actually perform the client due diligence on. So you want to run risk assessments on, and you want to document the identification information. Okay, so essentially it might be optional, but in the case of one limited company with 2 directors or a husband and wife, that would be 1. That's right.
Okay. So yeah, we do have some other questions here. I don't know if you want to get to these now, but there were some from the technology point of view. If a client doesn't want their data stored online, could it be saved as a PDF and just maintained?
Yeah, actually, our information isn't stored online. We do have the ability to do an electronic check on our website if you don't have AML Centre or don't want to do the checks in the product, but the report that we save back gets saved locally on the machine. That's all on the TaxCalc desktop product. Okay,
and the question there about is this an online or cloud software? It is all stored. It's desktop. Is the answer to that. So, okay, thank you very much for that run through. Before we get on to there's a few questions that are coming in and quite rapidly as well, but before we get to that, we did want to just ask you if we could bring the poll up. We just wanted to know what you thought, if you'd be interested in a follow-up with one of our specialists or your account managers. If you could bring that up, Dean.
Yeah, I'll pop that poll up now. So yeah, we have had lots of questions coming about pricing and how it works and additional functionality and things. If you do want one of our guys to arrange a call with you to talk through any of those points, then please do answer yes to the poll that should be up on your screens now or down at the polls. section on your browser. If not, then feel free to tick no. That's absolutely fine.
You could do that. So while we're waiting for that, let's just take a couple of extra questions. So this is a recap of how often do you need to do the client due diligence risk assessment? Is that every year, or do you just wait for an event?
Yeah, I think certain events can trigger you to require an additional client due diligence, and also dependent on your policy to sort of, if you had a low risk client, you might decide only to do it yearly or bi-yearly. Higher risk clients, you might decide to do them more often. I don't know, Dean, if you've got a particular, were you listening?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. A lot of it is event driven. So if something changes with the nature of that client, then yes, you should probably consider doing a further check. But actually, if it's a low risk client that's run of the mill, nothing changes, nothing indicates new risk for that client, then you're not going to be not complying with the regulations by not doing one once a year. It does place the onus on you to assess the risk, and if you've assessed the risk as low, then yeah, you shouldn't feel compelled to do one every year if there's no indication of why you shouldn't. I was just slightly distracted by quite an interesting question that came into the panel there. So AML training, formal AML training can be quite expensive and quite onerous. The question was, should the costs be charged onto your clients? What do you think, Siobhan? Would you charge the costs onto the clients of your AML training?
I suppose there's got to be a consideration of everything you're having to do in your practice to facilitate, providing a service to a client. So I don't think I'd directly charge on the training, but obviously the price would reflect that. What do you think, Dean?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I think, I'm sure I wouldn't be surprised at all if my solicitor charged me for electronic verification checks that they've had to do to satisfy their own regulations and itemise everything else that they incur. Yeah, for me, I certainly wouldn't itemise charging clients. And I think there are a lot of free resources out there. I think because it's such a hot topic amongst the professional bodies at the moment, lots of people are picking up on that and putting on various talks and webinars. We've done this one today. We had a talk that we ran 3 times over Accountex that was popular. We had Anne White come on here before, talking through her practice assurance visit that was highly focused on AML. And I think just reading the CCAB guidance itself, I mean, as I said, it's 137 pages. That's quite a sit-down project to go through. If you've got a team in the office where you need people to get up to date, give someone a project of, go read that and present back your main findings to the rest of us as a group. I think there are plenty of resources out there that you can probably meet the requirement without going as far as paid training from a specialist. A lot of that, I think, like much of complying with AML is looking at the risk to your practice. If you have mainly low risk clients, then there's plenty of free resources out there that I think can bring your knowledge up to the level required to comply.
I guess it might be worth implying, if your prices are going up, explaining that this might be one of the reasons, and that would help with that, delivering that message. Maybe. I
think clients typically care little for the costs of their accountant, but
I suppose the overall cost is a concern. But yeah.
Okay, so look, we've kind of run out of time. There were 2 very quick questions I'd like to get to that have come in. It's always at the end, lots and lots of questions come in, and we try and get to as many as possible. There were a few questions there about people who want to take demos. We'll come back to you on an individual basis around that. Can you duplicate due diligent answer from client to the other similar client in the same sector?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have an option to sort of copy answers between clients. There is the option to create different templates. So you could use a different template for different types of client, but not pre-filled with the answers in there.
Right.
So there is a flexibility in what you do, but not the answers.
Okay.
To be.
And then one final question, we'll have to wrap up at that point. Is, my husband is a company secretary, but has no involvement in the business. Would he need to have AML training as an officer? It's the MRLO he will have to.
That's a very good question. So I guess this is boom related. So if he is the company secretary of the regulated business, yeah, I'm pretty sure company secretaries are an officer for the boom part of the regulations. So would they need AML training? AML training. Okay. So I was going to answer the question that I thought I was asked, not the question that you actually asked. Yeah, I think they would be at a boom. So the requirements that are placed on them for that, ensuring they're a person of integrity and possibly need to be registered with your supervisory body as being a boom of that regulated practice. But from a training perspective, I think that's really relevant to their role. So if they don't have any involvement in firm policy or in their day-to-day activities for the firm, there isn't involvement in identifying potential suspicious activity, then I would say no, they don't need specific AML training just because they are the company secretary.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you for joining us. We've had a huge amount of areas covered today, and unfortunately we have run out of time, but we hope you found that very, very useful. If you have been intrigued by the AML Centre product, if you go to taxcalc.com/AML Centre, you can find out all about it in terms of pricing. We touched on earlier, it's £84 for the 24 client version, and then that ranges up to £472 for the unlimited version. So there's lots of very packages within that. So next week, Dean and I will be here. Also, I will not be here, but Dean will be joined by Martin Davey, who is the product director for our practice management products, and they're going to be doing a deep dive into the Communication Centre product, which is allowing you to control and manage the email that you need to send to clients around document requests, etc. So that's next Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. If you go to the events section on taxcalc.com, you can register for that. And Dean and I will be back on the 24th of August, where we're going back to MTD yet again, where we're going to be looking at customer communication, customer education around MTD. So when do you need to communicate with clients? What should you be saying to have maximum impact, and how should you be delivering that? And once again, we're joined by Ariona, who was Ariona Bayrakerte. I never get that right. Who was part of our MTD Brains Trust and has been doing quite a lot. She's been sort of forging ahead with that client communication. So she's got some really, really interesting ideas. That'll be on the 24th of August, once again, 2:30. Keep a lookout for announcements and alerts around that. So until then, thank you very much once again, Dean and Siobhan, and thank you for joining us.